The desert sun hung low, a bruised orange smear against the horizon, as Evan trudged along the cracked asphalt of Highway 14. His boots scuffed the grit, kicking up faint plumes of dust that clung to his faded jeans like a second skin. The air shimmered with heat, thick with the tang of gasoline and sagebrush, and his shadow stretched long and thin beside him, a silent companion to a man who'd grown accustomed to his own solitude. At 53, Evan was a mechanic by trade, his hands stained with decades of oil and regret, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a flannel shirt that had seen better days. He lived in a sagging trailer on the edge of Ocotillo Wells, a speck of a town where tumbleweeds outnumbered people and the wind carried whispers of forgotten dreams. He'd been walking home from the shop, a half-mile stretch he'd memorized down to every pothole, when he saw it, a shape in the ditch, motionless, like a discarded hubcap or a chunk of blown tire. But as he drew closer, squinting against the glare, the shape resolved into something alive, or barely so. A tortoise, its shell dulled by dust and etched with a jagged crack, lay tilted on its side, legs limp as if it had surrendered to the relentless sun. Evan stopped, his breath catching in his throat, a faint wheeze from years of smoking. He scratched the graying stubble on his jaw, muttering, "Well, hell. What's this now?" The creature didn't move, didn't even blink, but its dark eyes glinted faintly, pinning him where he stood. Evan's life was a clockwork of routine, wrench on metal, coffee gone cold, the creak of his trailer's steps as he sank into a recliner with a beer and the hum of late-night TV. This broken thing, wasn't part of the script. He could walk away, let the desert claim it as it had claimed so much else. But something stirred in his chest, a dull ache he hadn't felt since the divorce papers landed on his workbench 10 years back, ink still wet with accusation. Maybe it was the way the tortoise seemed to wait, patient and uncomplaining, that tugged at him. He crouched, wincing as his knees popped, and the heat radiating from the asphalt seared his palms. Up close, the shell was a mosaic of scuts, chipped and weathered, the crack running like a fault line across its back. "You're a sorry sight," he said gruffly, his voice gravelly from disuse. He glanced around, no cars, no witnesses, just the endless ribbon of road and the whine of cicadas in the scrub. With a sigh that bordered on a growl, he slid his hands beneath the tortoise, surprised by its weight, its cool, leathery skin brushing his calluses. It didn't struggle, just shifted slightly, as if testing his grip. Evan carried it the half-mile home, sweat beading on his brow, the tortoise's head bobbing faintly with each step. His trailer loomed ahead, a dented tin box squatting amid a graveyard of rusted car parts and sun-bleached tires. The screen door squealed as he shouldered it open, and the air inside hit him like a stale breath, warm, heavy with the musk of unwashed dishes and cigarette smoke. He set the tortoise on the linoleum floor, where it sat, unblinking, amid a scatter of crumbs and a toppled beer can. "Don't get comfortable," he warned, though his tone lacked conviction. He grabbed his keys, the jangle sharp in the quiet, and drove his rattling pickup to the only vet in town, a squat building with peeling paint and a sign that read Ocotillo Animal Care. The receptionist, a girl with a nose ring and a bored drawl, raised an eyebrow as he lumbered in, the tortoise cradled awkwardly in his arms. "Found it on the highway," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. The vet, a wiry woman named Dr. Lopez, peered at the creature through thick glasses. "Desert tortoise," she said, her fingers tracing the cracked shell. "Likely dumped. People don't realize they live forever, well, almost. This one's lucky you came along." "Lucky," Evan echoed, the word tasting bitter. She cleaned the wound, taped it with a temporary fix, and handed him a bill that made him wince, $87 he'd planned to spend on a case of beer. He paid it anyway, grumbling under his breath, and drove home with the tortoise on the passenger seat, its head poking out like a curious passenger. Back at the trailer, he set it in a cardboard box lined with an old towel, the fabric pilling under its claws. He sank into his recliner, staring at the creature, Rusty, he decided to call it, for the reddish dust caked on its shell, and wondered what madness had possessed him to bring it here. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trailer's loose siding, a mournful sound that matched the hollow in his chest. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating Rusty's steady gaze. For the first time in years, Evan felt watched, not just by the tortoise but by the weight of a choice he hadn't meant to make. He exhaled a plume of smoke, the haze curling toward the ceiling, and thought, what am I supposed to do with you? The question lingered, unanswered, as the desert night pressed in, vast and quiet, around a man who'd forgotten how to hope. The morning sun crept through the trailer's cracked blinds, slicing the dim interior with bars of gold that fell across Rusty's shell like a spotlight. Evan woke to the sound of his own snoring, a jagged rasp that jolted him upright in the recliner. His neck ached from the awkward angle, and the stale tang of last night's cigarette lingered on his tongue. He rubbed his eyes, gritty with sleep, and glanced at the cardboard box on the floor. Rusty was still there, a quiet lump of resolve, his head tucked halfway into his shell as if he'd been waiting out the night alongside Evan's restless dreams. Still alive, huh? Evan muttered, his voice a low rumble in the stillness. He hauled himself up, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and shuffled to the kitchenette. The sink was a battlefield of greasy plates and coffee mugs, the counter dusted with crumbs like a fine layer of sand. He filled a chipped bowl with water from the tap, its drip a metronome to his mornings, and set it beside Rusty. The tortoise extended his neck, slow as dawn, and lapped at it, the soft plink of droplets breaking the silence. Evan watched, arms crossed, a frown tugging at his mouth. Don't get used to this, he said, though the words felt hollow even to him. Outside, the desert heat was already rising, the air thick with the scent of creosote and baked earth. Evan dragged an old wooden crate from the clutter of his yard, rusted tools and sun-warped planks, and fashioned a makeshift pen beside the trailer. He lined it with gravel, muttering about the waste of time, and set Rusty inside. The tortoise ambled forward, his claws scraping faintly, and settled beneath the scant shade of a Joshua tree, its spiky silhouette stark against the sky. Evan wiped sweat from his brow, the salt stinging his eyes, and stood there a moment, hands on hips, staring at the creature. You're a damn fool for surviving out here, he said, though he wasn't sure if he meant Rusty or himself. Days slipped by, each one a mirror of the last, but now punctuated by Rusty's presence. Evan found himself checking the pen each morning, grumbling as he tossed in handfuls of dandelion greens he'd yanked from the shop's patchy lot. He'd meant to let the tortoise fend for itself, maybe release it into the wild where it belonged, but the vet's words echoed, dumped. Lucky you came along. Guilt, or something like it, kept him tethered. He scoured the internet on his ancient laptop, its fan whirring like a dying engine, learning about desert tortoises, how they needed shade, calcium, a life measured in decades. You'll outlive me, you stubborn bastard, he said one evening, tossing a carrot nub into the pen. Rusty chewed with methodical patience, and Evan felt an odd flicker of satisfaction, quickly smothered by a drag on his cigarette. The trailer, though, was another story. Its chaos had always been a comfort, a reflection of the mess inside him, divorce papers still crumpled in a drawer, a decade of dust on shelves holding nothing but empty bottles. But Rusty's steady gaze seemed to judge it all. One afternoon, Evan stubbed out a cigarette halfway through, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. Fine, he growled, snatching a trash bag from under the sink. He cleared the cans, swept the crumbs, the clatter of aluminum and the hiss of a broom filling the air. The ashtray stayed, but he opened a window, letting a breeze sweep through, sharp with the scent of sage. Rusty watched from his box, brought inside for the night, and Evan caught himself wondering what the tortoise made of this sudden shift. Then came the kid. A scrawny boy, maybe 10, with a mop of sandy hair and a sunburned nose, appeared at the edge of Evan's yard one blistering afternoon. He crouched by the pen, peering at Rusty with wide, curious eyes. "That your turtle?" he called, his voice high and clear. Evan, elbow-deep in a Chevy's engine at the shop across the road, straightened with a scowl. "Tortoise," he corrected, wiping grease on his jeans. "And he ain't mine. Just keeping him." The kid, Tommy, he said his name was, grinned, undeterred. "Can I see him up close?" Evan hesitated, the old instinct to shoo people away rising like bile. But Tommy's gaze was earnest, not mocking, and Rusty chose that moment to plod toward the edge of the pen, as if an invitation. "Fine," Evan grunted, trudging over. He lifted the tortoise, its weight familiar now, and set it on the ground. Tommy knelt, tracing the shell's crack with a fingertip. "He's cool," he said softly. "Like a tank." Evan snorted, a sound that might have been a laugh if he'd let it. "Yeah, a slow one." Tommy started showing up daily, chattering about school, his bike, the lizards he caught in the wash. Evan answered in grunts or nods, but the kid's presence chipped at his walls. One evening, Tommy lingered as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. "You ever fix cars with your dad?" Evan asked, surprising himself. Tommy shrugged, kicking a pebble. "Nah, he's gone. Just me and Mom." The words hung there, heavy, and Evan felt that ache again, sharper now. He handed Tommy a wrench, greasy and warm from his palm. "Come on, Ben. I'll show you something." They bent over an old Ford's hood, the clank of metal and Tommy's eager questions filling the dusk. Rusty sat nearby, a silent sentinel, his shell catching the last light. Evan glanced at him, then at the kid, and felt the rhythm of his day's tilt, still slow, still quiet, but no longer empty. The desert wind sighed through the scrub, and for the first time in years, Evan didn't reach for a cigarette. Instead, he breathed deep, tasting hope in the dry, wild air. The days grew shorter, the desert sun retreating earlier each evening, leaving behind a chill that seeped into the trailer's thin walls. Evan felt it in his bones, a stiffness that matched the creak of his steps as he moved between the shop and Rusty's pen. The tortoise had become a fixture, his slow patrols of the gravel enclosure a metronome to Evan's once predictable solitude. The pen had evolved too, boards nailed tighter, a tarp rigged for shade, a shallow dish of water glinting like a tiny oasis. Evan told himself it was practical, not affection, but the way he lingered to watch Rusty munch on spinach leaves betrayed him. Tommy's visits had settled into a rhythm, his sneakers kicking up dust as he bounded over after school, a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. The kid was a chatterbox, his stories tumbling out, how he'd aced a math test, how his mom burned the spaghetti again. Evan listened, half distracted, showing him how to tighten a bolt or check oil levels, his gruff corrections softened by the occasional "not bad, kid." Tommy's hands, small and eager, mimicked Evan's, and the clatter of tools became a strange duet beneath the hum of cicadas. But Tommy wasn't the only one drawn to Rusty's quiet orbit. One Saturday, a girl appeared, Lila, 13, with sharp eyes and a braid that swung like a pendulum as she leaned over the pen. She lived 2 trailers down, her voice carrying a lilt of defiance. "Tommy said you got a tortoise," she announced, hands on hips. Evan, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag, nodded warily. "Yeah. So?" Lila crouched, studying Rusty with a scientist's precision. "He's old. Bet he's seen more than all of us." Evan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the weight in her words, but said nothing. Soon, Lila brought a friend, Javi, a wiry boy with a chipped front tooth and a laugh that burst like a firecracker. The 3 of them became a trio, orbiting Evan's yard like moths to a flame. They'd sprawl in the dirt, watching Rusty plod along, trading theories about his past. "Maybe he escaped a zoo," Tommy ventured. "Or a circus," Javi countered, grinning. Lila rolled her eyes. "He's a survivor, that's all." Evan, tinkering nearby with a carburetor, found himself smirking at their chatter, the sound weaving into the desert's vast silence. The trailer, once a fortress of clutter, began to shift under this new tide. Evan scrubbed the counters, hauled junk to the dump, the thump of trash bags a quiet rebellion against his old ways. He quit smoking entirely one crisp morning, crushing his last pack under his boot as Rusty watched, unblinking. "For your damn lungs," he muttered, though he meant his own. The air cleared, sharp with the scent of pine cleaner and the faint musk of tortoise. He even dragged an old radio outside, its static crackling until it landed on a station playing Johnny Cash, the low twang a backdrop to the kids' laughter. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard, Tommy asked, "Why'd you keep him, Evan?" "Rusty, I mean." The question caught him off guard, his wrench pausing mid-turn. He squinted at the tortoise, who was nosing a pebble with deliberate care. didn't have a choice," he said finally, voice rough. He was just there. Tommy nodded, satisfied, but Lila's gaze lingered, sharp and knowing, as if she saw through the lie. The kids started lingering past dusk, their voices softening as the stars pricked the sky. Evan, reluctant host, found himself brewing instant coffee, bitter and black, handing chipped mugs to Lila and Javi while Tommy sipped Kool-Aid. They'd sit on overturned crates, the metal cool against their legs, watching Rusty settle into his nighttime stillness. "He's like a grandpa," Javi said once, and Evan chuckled, a sound that rumbled deep in his chest. "Yeah, a cranky one." But it wasn't just the kids. Rusty had cracked something open in Evan, a fissure he hadn't known was there. He'd catch himself humming as he worked, the tune faint but persistent, or pausing to watch a hawk circle overhead, its wings slicing the blue. The shop felt less like a prison, the grease on his hands a badge of something steady. He taught Tommy how to change a tire, Lila how to spot a bad spark plug, Javi how to listen for an engine's heartbeat. Their questions, endless, earnest, pulled him out of himself, and he answered with a patience he didn't know he had. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the kids biked home under a sky streaked with purple, Evan knelt by the pen. Rusty's head emerged, slow and deliberate, his eyes meeting Evan's with a quiet trust. Evan reached out, his rough fingers brushing the tortoise's shell, warm from the day's heat. "Your trouble, you know that," he said softly, a smile tugging at his lips. The wind sighed through the Joshua trees, carrying the faint scent of dust and freedom, and Evan felt the weight of his loneliness lift, just a little. The desert stretched wide around him, but for the first time, it didn't feel so empty, just a canvas, waiting for the next brushstroke. The desert winter crept in, subtle but insistent, frosting the edges of Evan's world with a brittle chill. Mornings dawned gray, the sun a pale disk behind a veil of clouds, and the air bit at his knuckles as he carried Rusty's water dish outside. The tortoise moved slower now, his steps deliberate, as if savoring the last warmth trapped in the gravel. Evan watched him from the trailer's crooked porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, the bitter warmth seeping into his palms. The yard was quieter too, Tommy, Lila, and Javi bundled in school schedules and holidays, but their absence left a hollow that surprised him, a space he hadn't known they'd filled. He'd built Rusty a burrow in the pen, a low mound of dirt and straw beneath a plywood roof, lined with an old blanket he'd found in a closet. "Don't freeze on me," he'd muttered, tucking the edges in, his breath fogging in the dusk. Rusty had nosed his way inside, a faint rustle marking his retreat, and Evan felt a pang, pride, maybe, or something softer he couldn't name. The tortoise was tougher than he'd expected, a survivor carved from time itself, and yet here Evan was, fussing over him like a mother hen. He snorted at the thought, kicking a pebble across the yard, the clack sharp in the stillness. The shop kept him busy, its rhythm of clanging metal and hissed curses a lifeline to his old self. But even there, things had shifted. Customers lingered longer, drawn by whispers of the gruff mechanic with the tortoise, and Evan found himself nodding instead of scowling, his answers clipped but not cold. One afternoon, a woman, Maria, Tommy's mom, dropped by with a flat tire, her smile tired but warm. "He talks about you nonstop," she said, leaning against her beat-up sedan as Evan patched the rubber. "You and that tortoise. Says you're teaching him stuff his dad never did." Evan grunted, focused on the tire, but her words lodged in his chest, heavy and bright. The kids returned when the school break hit, their voices cutting through the winter quiet like a sudden thaw. They brought gifts for Rusty, wilted lettuce from Lila's fridge, a carrot stub from Javi's lunchbox, and Evan let them pile into the trailer, their boots tracking mud across the linoleum he'd scrubbed clean. He'd found an old space heater in the shop's back room, its hum a low pulse as it warmed the corner where Rusty's box Saturday. "He's hibernating soon," Lila said knowingly, peering at the tortoise. "They do that when it's cold." Evan nodded, impressed despite himself. "Guess we'll see." But hibernation wasn't the end of it. One evening, as snowflakes, rare for Ocotillo Wells, dusted the ground like ash, Tommy lingered after the others left. He sat cross-legged by Rusty's box, his small hands fidgeting with a shoelace. "Evan," he said, voice soft, "you ever get lonely?" Before Rusty, I mean. The question hit like a wrench to the gut, and Evan froze, halfway through pouring coffee into a mug. He set the pot down, the clink loud in the quiet, and turned to face the kid. Tommy's eyes were steady, too old for his years, and Evan felt the weight of 10 solitary winters press against his ribs. Yeah, he said finally, the word rough as sandpaper. Sometimes. He sank into the recliner, the springs groaning, and stared at Rusty, who'd poked his head out, blinking slowly. Didn't think about it much. Just, was. Tommy nodded, as if that made sense, and traced the crack in Rusty's shell with a fingertip. He's like us, huh? Kinda beat up, but still here. Evan's throat tightened, and he took a sip of coffee to hide it, the burn grounding him. Yeah, kid. Still here. That night, alone again, Evan stood by the pen under a sky thick with stars, the cold biting through his flannel. Rusty was burrowed deep, a shadow in the straw, and Evan crouched, his knees popping. He'd stayed, through the vet bill, the kids, the slow unraveling of his walls, when he could have walked away. The choice had crept up on him, small acts stacking like stones, a pen built, a cigarette ditched, a wrench handed to a boy with no father. He pressed a hand to the ground, the frost slick against his skin, and felt the earth hum with a quiet, stubborn life. The next day, he drove to the hardware store, the pickup rattling over potholes. He bought lumber, nails, a bag of kale, Rusty's favorite, and spent the afternoon reinforcing the pen, the hammers thud a steady pulse. The kids showed up midway, their breath puffing in the air, and pitched in, Tommy holding boards, Lila passing nails, Javi joking about Rusty's mansion. By dusk, it stood solid, a testament to something Evan couldn't quite voice. Maria stopped by later, a tray of tamales in her hands, steam curling from the foil. For the crew, she said, smiling. Evan took it, the warmth seeping into his fingers, and muttered a thanks that felt clumsy but real. As the kids ate, laughing over sticky fingers, Evan watched from the porch, Rusty's box at his feet. The tortoise stirred, his head emerging to nose at a kale leaf, and Evan felt the rhythm of his days settle, slow, steady, alive. He'd chosen to stay, to care, and the weight of it wasn't a burden but a tether, grounding him to a life he hadn't known he could claim. Spring crept into Ocotillo Wells like a shy guest, the desert blooming in tentative bursts of yellow wildflowers and the air softening with a hint of warmth. Evan felt it in the looseness of his shoulders as he worked, the ache of winter fading from his joints. Rusty emerged from his burrow one morning, his shell dusted with straw, his slow shuffle a quiet fanfare against the gravel. Evan knelt by the pen, a rare grin tugging at his grizzled face. Took your time, didn't you, he said, tossing a dandelion green that Rusty nosed with familiar patience. The tortoise's dark eyes met his, steady and unhurried, and Evan felt a swell of something, relief, maybe, or a pride too tender to name. The trailer had become a hub, its once silent walls now echoing with the clatter of life. Tommy, Lila, and Javi were fixtures, their bikes leaning against the siding, tires caked with desert mud. They'd sprawl in the yard, tools scattered around a half-fixed engine, their voices a tangle of laughter and argument. Evan guided them with a gruff patience, his hand steady as he showed Tommy how to balance a carburetor, Lila how to weld a seam, Javi how to hear a misfire before it happened. Grease stained their fingers, a badge of their shared labor, and Evan found himself pausing to watch, the clank of metal a song he hadn't known he'd missed. Maria started dropping by more, her presence a quiet thread in the weave. She'd bring food, enchiladas one day, a thermos of pozole the next, her smile softening the edges of Evan's days. You're good with them, she said once, nodding at the kids as they raced Rusty across the yard, cheering his glacial pace. Evan shrugged, wiping oil from his hands with a rag. They're good kids, he muttered, but her gaze lingered, warm and searching, and he felt a flicker of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The shop thrived too, word spreading of the mechanic who'd tamed a tortoise and a pack of misfits. Customers lingered, drawn by the sight of Rusty plodding near the garage door, the kids' chatter a backdrop to the hum of engines. Evan didn't mind the company now, his nods turning to short exchanges, his scowl easing into something softer. He'd catch himself humming, old cash tunes, mostly, the sound rising over the whine of a drill, and once, Javi caught him, grinning. "You're happy, huh?" the boy teased. Evan snorted, but didn't deny it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose, Evan sat on the porch with Rusty at his side. The tortoise chewed a kale leaf, the soft crunch a counterpoint to the desert's hush. The kids had biked home, their goodbyes ringing in the air, and Maria had just left, her taillights fading down the road. Evan leaned back, the wood creaking beneath him, and let the quiet settle. The trailer glowed behind him, its windows spilling light onto the yard, the radio crooning faintly through the screen door. His hands rested on his knees, rough and lined, but steady now, no tremble, no need for a cigarette to fill the space. He thought back to that scorching day on Highway 14, the cracked shell in the ditch, the choice he hadn't planned to make. Rusty had been the spark, slow, stubborn, unyielding, and from him a life had unfurled. The kids, the shop, Maria's quiet kindness, they'd all followed, drawn by a creature that moved at its own pace. Evan reached down, his fingers brushing Rusty's shell, warm from the day's sun. "You're a hell of a thing," he said softly, a chuckle rumbling in his chest. Rusty blinked, unperturbed, and Evan felt the weight of his new normal, solid, earned, alive. The stars emerged, sharp against the velvet sky, and Evan stayed there, the desert stretching wide around him. It wasn't grand, this triumph, just a man, a tortoise, a handful of strays finding their way. But it was enough. The wind sighed through the Joshua trees, carrying the faint scent of sage and possibility, and Evan breathed it in, his heart mended by the smallest of steps. And there it is, Evan's story, a quiet journey from solitude to connection, sparked by a cracked shell tortoise and fueled by the courage to care. I loved writing this tale of small acts and big hearts, the kind of warmth that lingers long after the last word. If you enjoyed it too, subscribe below so you don't miss the next story. I've got more characters and corners of the world waiting to come alive. Thanks for reading, and see you in the next one.